Guys, welcome to the First Responder Playbook. I have a special guest with me today. I have Sharon Dunlevy. She is an educational advocate for children in foster care. She brings her education that brings the educational needs of children in foster care to the attention of those who can change policies and practices that would give more children in foster care the ability to succeed educationally. Her primary work includes training foster parents on the educational laws that affect their children in foster care and how to use those laws to ensure these children graduate successfully. She does speaking. She's an influencer. So I'm excited to have her. I'm excited to talk about how what she does can be applied to the law enforcement and first responder world. Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brent. I'm so excited to be here. I appreciate you letting me come on your show. As I was saying before we started recording, when I got this suggestion to come and speak at this podcast, I was kind of like, well, I don't know. Why would I do that? And then I thought about it. I'm like, of course, first responders deal with kids in foster care, probably more than, like an average citizen, right? But what does it mean when they're in foster care, and especially that trauma side? I would imagine that a lot of first responders meet kids in the midst of trauma and not always know how to handle that, right? Like, these poor kids are just going crazy, and it's like, why are they like this? Why are they reacting the way they are? And a lot of that has to do with maybe they've got trauma in their past, like they're a kid in foster care or something has happened to them, and it's going to dictate how they react in the midst of a crisis. And so I just thought that was kind of an intriguing idea to come on here and talk about, what does trauma look like for these kids? And then what are some ways maybe I could make your jobs easier by knowing how to then respond to a kid who has trauma in their background when they're in the middle of a crisis?
Absolutely. So, how did you initially get in like the foster care world?
So studied to be an educator, special education specifically, but then I got called to ministry. So I was actually a children's pastor for 20 years, and then decided I wanted to go back and branch out again to more vulnerable children. So I kind of bounced around from a different jobs, and but with my special education background, there was a job opening at a foster care licensing agency here in Indianapolis, and it just seemed like the perfect fit. I knew the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act worked. I knew all of that. And so I took the job and just kind of fell in love with the whole foster care program and the kids and the foster parents and just what they're going through and what they need educationally, because a lot of times we don't talk about that a lot. You mentioned before we started recording that the foster kids tend to get forgotten, and I think they do. We know they exist, but outside of maybe a TV show where they might mention, somebody got arrested and, oh, they were a foster kid, right? Like, that's what we hear, but that's not the foster care world. These are real kids with real issues, and a lot of times they're getting lost in the system and getting lost in the educational system. So that's what I do, is specifically focus on what does trauma do to a child that causes them not to learn the same way as a child who has not had trauma? And how do we then overcome that so that once they do graduate, they're ready to live independently, to get a job, to have a career, to have a family, and be successful as adults?
So, first responders, it's part of the job. We respond to these critical incidents, whether it be between family members or just overall in general. And that's police, fire, EMS. We're all going to deal with that at some point.
Yes.
Can you kind of touch on like how the trauma affects them and like what it does to these children?
Yeah, so trauma not only affects a child emotionally, it actually affects the brain physically. And we're learning, brain research is just blooming right now. We're learning so much about the brain. And what happens is it literally shrinks neurons in the brain. And so certain pathways shut down. And what happens is with that is the more negative experiences, the more of those neurons that build around those negative experiences grow. And so they become stuck in kind of a survival mode. And I'm sure all of you have heard the terms fight, flight, or freeze as a way that people respond. That is doubled or tripled for a kid who has trauma, right? They are, because they're not in their logical brain at all, they're already children. So they're not necessarily logical, anyways, but then their brains are shrunk as well. So they're even younger than they seem to be. And they're going to be living in that survival mode. Am I going to fight? Am I going to freeze? Am I going to fly away, run away? And I'm sure you've all experienced it. You've had a crisis come up and you've had a kid who just came out swinging at you, and you're like, whoa, I'm just here. But just the uniform itself can cause a kid to overreact. And especially if they're like in foster care and the last time they saw a uniform like that was because the person removed them from their home. Right? So the uniform itself or authority, or you may have that kid that hides when you're there. They never want to come out. Trying to get them to come out of a closet that they hid in when something is happening around them. How hard is that? Because they don't know who to trust and they're in that freeze or flight mode. Kids that run away, that happens a lot, unfortunately. And as a first responder, you've got to deal with what's happening in front of you. You can't be worrying about the kid who's running down the street, but then who is worried about the kid who's running down the street? And that's a trauma response. It is just all survival instinct, and they don't know how to break out of that survival mode to think logically. And we can teach our kids to overcome trauma, but it's not going to be in that moment, right? It's got to be over consistent time. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of new experiences. So in that moment is when we really see that flight, fight, or freeze and try to deal with that.
So, is there anything like when they get on scene, like these first responders, is there anything they can do to kind of help overcome those type of, situations when they pop up?
Yeah, maintaining obviously some calmness around yourself, getting down to their level, talking to them about things that are not related to the situation. So if a kid is really, really triggered and screaming and yelling, pointing out something around them, like, oh, wait, do you see that bird? It breaks that pattern. So anything you can do to kind of disrupt those thoughts. We talk a lot when I teach my foster parents how to overcome meltdowns. We talk a lot about using those senses. I know a lot of firemen, especially, but police officers too, will carry stuffed animals, right, in their cars. Well, it's not just the comfort of the stuffed animal, it's actually the feel of it. You're grounding them in their senses, and if you can do that, it helps to kind of break that pattern. So, calmness, grounding them in their senses, maybe instead of saying, "You need to sit over here," give them 2 choices. A lot of times kids in trauma feel like they don't have any power, and so when we tell them to do something, that's one more time they don't have a choice. So saying, "Hey, I can't have you right here, but can you either sit over there or over there?" and let them choose. It just gives them that teeny little sense of choice, but that gives them that little bit of power that might help calm them down. Um, Other things to watch for is if they're very hyper vigilant, they're always looking around. That might be a sign that this is a kid who has experienced trauma before, and just know to approach them cautiously, quietly. Like I said, it's hard, obviously, because you're in crisis, your adrenaline's running, all of that, but as much as you can not show that. The other thing you can do is, even if they don't want to talk to you or whatever, is just breathe with them. You know how yawns are contagious? Breathing is contagious. So if you're going to stand and take some deep breaths in front of them, they will start mimicking it without you having to say anything because it's a neural response and it's an automatic neural response that we have. So those are just some things you can do.
I love that. I'm actually, working on my ICF coaching certification right now,
Good.
and that is something I've had to overcome as a first responder, especially a police officer, is our first instinct is to always be in control.
Yes.
And I don't think most of us mean it in a negative way,
No.
but you're trying to handle the situation. Well, now that I'm in learning these coaching techniques, that is one of the things they rely heavily on is don't lead them or don't tell them we're gonna go somewhere.
Mhm.
Ask them questions to have them get there.
Yes. Yes.
And that has been, I don't wanna call it a struggle for me, but it's a change
Mhm.
because I've just so conditioned to always being in control.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I'm a control freak. I know I am. You
Yep.
know? And as a parent, I had to overcome that, right? I mean, once you're a parent and it's like, "Holy cow, I don't have control of anything." But, yeah, I mean, I can imagine it's a huge mindset shift, and yeah, your thought is on what I need to do next. It's not necessarily that person in front of you, as once you know they're safe, then you've gotta move on to who's gonna be next that needs to be safe, or how do I contain this situation? But, yeah, if you can just slow down just a hair to make sure the kid is calm and okay, then, that's the way to do it. And you guys work in teams. So if you've got somebody on your team that is just really good with kids, that that's their assigned job, right? When you reach a scene, that they're looking for the kids to get them corralled and calm down. And yeah.
I think that's a very good point you make because, I've been a supervisor at 2 different agencies, and that is something I've learned to take into account is, like, gone are the days of law enforcement of, like, just throwing everybody on a shift and saying, "Oh, that's how it is." Now we have to manage personalities and people,
Yeah.
and every person is strong in a certain area, and so, like, I've come to realize, like, I don't have kids yet. I'm
Mhm.
not terrible with them, but, somebody with kids, I would probably have them go deal with them before I would
Yeah.
because they know how to interact with them better than I do, and not saying
Mhm.
like I said, I'm not saying I'm terrible with them, but I do know some of my partners that are terrible with kids. Um, and they would I would probably say, "Hey, go deal with the parents. Let
Yeah.
somebody else deal with the children." And that's something we have to take into account is like, "Hey, like,
Mhm.
you might be a little bit better in this situation over here, and I might be better over here."
Yeah. Teamwork in any field is a huge piece, and we don't do it alone. You're not going in and you're not going to be the hero of the day. It's the team that's going to do it. And I think we lose some of that in our society, right? We've become very individualistic. So bringing back this sense of a teamwork and everybody can be part of a team. When foster parents become foster parents, they realize very quickly that they are not doing this alone. There is a team. They've got case managers, they've got therapists, they got school staff. Everything is a team, and it should be a team around this kid that are all working together for the best of that child. And the really good foster parents and schools and case managers understand that, and they put that child in the center. But sometimes we lose focus. We all do. And so I always really like to go back to that team mentality because, yeah, it really does make a difference. And if you know your supervisor is going to pick you to do something that you are good at and you enjoy over something you don't enjoy, you're more likely to enjoy your work, right? You're more likely to feel appreciated, to be seen and heard, and know that you're bringing skills. Those ones that you said are not good with the kids, they're probably really good at other things. They might be the one that needs to go through the door first because, they have no fear.
Yep.
Right? I mean, everybody has a strength. It's a matter of finding that strength, and then how do you each work together to make those strengths be a big whole that is powerful.
So, can you kind of touch on like usually our involvement is like once the situation's over with, maybe DHS might come out, or I currently work for a tribal agency, and so like ours is called like tri- you know uh uh tribal child welfare
Mhm.
or Indian child welfare.
Yeah.
Um, you know, What's the process like once they're out of that situation and they're placed into custody of,
Mhm.
the state, tribe, whoever it may be?
Mhm.
What's the process so that like we can kind of have a good understanding of that process and like
Sure.
and what happens like once they're in that system?
Sure. So what usually happens, and of course state by state slightly different, but overall most states, they'll either well, what usually happens is a kid will be removed from a scary situation, whatever. They've decided that they cannot live in this home. And whoever is over that, child welfare, child services, there's different names, but they'll take the child into their system. And immediately they are going to contact all of the licensing agencies within that state. So there's going to be a state level one, but there are also going to be individual licensing agencies because there's different types of foster care. There's foster care that they call level 1 and 2, and those are usually kids that are pretty low need, not no major trauma behaviors, all of that. And then you have 3s and 4s, which are what's considered therapeutic foster care. They tend to have some more mental health issues, have more, they're going to need therapists and work with that. And foster parents have to be trained to be specifically therapeutic foster parents. But no matter what, they'll put this kind of broadcast out. There's like a email string, as well as they'll call licensing agencies. They'll say, "I have a 8-year-old girl that needs a home in this area," and the agencies will all say, "Well, I've got this family open," and they quickly contact the family, see, and it kind of is a first come first serve. So sometimes you'll get the call out, you'll call a family, they'll say, "Yeah, we could take them," and by that time, they've already placed the child. But that's really how it is. It's just kind of a major broadcast. Usually, it goes very quickly, very smoothly, especially in emergency placements. However, we do have issues when they are, teenagers. Sometimes it's harder to find families to take teenagers. So when you hear stories about kids living in the offices and stuff like that, it's usually older kids that are just harder to place. You don't often have kids living in foster care agency offices. That's some usually exaggerated, but for the most part, they are going to be placed. Sometimes, if they can't find a home that has an opening that can take them long term, they'll do what's called an emergency placement. And usually, foster care agencies will have somebody. We had this happen here in Indiana. um, Children were found. The family was from Kentucky, but they were right over the border in Indiana at a rest stop, living in their car. Children were removed in the middle of the night, called around. Our agency got the call in the middle of the night and had a family that was open and said, "Yes, we'll take them as an emergency placement." They ended up keeping those kids until they went back home. Mom finally got a job, got home, a house, all of that, and they were able to be returned to her. But she kept them for maybe 4 or 5 years, I think, before they were able to go back and live there. So that sometimes happens too. But that's kind of the process. Is yeah, they get as soon as they can be sent into a home, they're put into a home.
Now I know emergency placements are a little bit different, but like once they're emergency placed, is there like a permanent court order that comes down saying, "Hey, they're gonna be assigned to these families until
Yeah.
X, Y, and Z's met?"
Yes, yes, exactly. It becomes a court case. They go to the juvenile court system takes over. They work with the case managers. So the case managers will do a full report on what's happening with the family. The assigned case manager for the home that they're placed in will make sure that the home is all set. They'll all go to court, talk about, can this family keep them for a length of time? What's and then they also have to decide, a lot of states are moving to what we call a reunification plan. So most states, their plan is that we want mom and dad to be able to take the kids back. I mean, that's usually best, right? But they have to be able to meet certain, uh, expectations, and so that will be settled in court with the judge, and that comes a lot from the information that's gathered in those early stages. So if it's a drug or alcohol issue, or like this one family, like I said, mom they were living in the car, obviously they needed a home, but in order for them to get a home, mom needed a job, and so, um and sometimes there's a breakdown there, right? If you're in a state that doesn't have services that help these families get a job, get a home so they can get their kids back, there's a disconnect. But I think they're trying to improve that, in order for the families to be able to succeed and get their kids back.
So, these kids are going through all this trauma, the stress, the anxiety. How do you help them on the educational side so that they're succeeding in
Mhm.
moving towards, moving forward in life?
Sure. So what I do, when I started as an educational advocate in the licensing agency, I actually would go to like the IEP or the individualized education plan meetings. I would make sure that the schools understood that they were foster kids, what their triggers were, and all that. Now I work on my own and I run a foster care training business myself, and I do contract work through different states and licensing agencies, and I train their foster parents on what are the education laws that help foster kids, and then how do you apply those laws, and how do you talk to your schools about those laws. And so there's three laws that I teach: the Every Student Succeeds Act, which has pieces in it that allow kids who are in foster care, even if they change homes, they can stay in the same school, even if their new home is out of district. And so that what that does is, I mean, I've heard stories where kids in the past would have been at 23 different schools. I mean, it's crazy. How do you learn? So by not having them change schools every time they change a house, they're able to stay in one school, and that really makes a difference. Or if they do have to change schools, they can immediately enroll. In the past, schools would want their birth certificates, their shot records, all of this. Well, you imagine in an emergency placement or even just in general, a lot of times these parents don't pass that stuff on. And so foster parents don't have that information. And they were delaying enrollment, and they can't do that anymore. They have to enroll a kid immediately and get them into the classroom. Then I use the Individuals with Disabilities Act to make sure that they're getting accommodations and extra help, because generally they're going to be behind their peers. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the brain has shrunk and all of these things. So they need, and our brains can recover, but we have to be deliberate. We have to be constantly introducing new material and positive materials and positive reinforcement in order for that brain to redevelop and rewire so it's not sitting in fight, flight, or freeze anymore. And so I work with the schools to understand trauma-informed teaching, and things like when a kid is acting up, instead of sending them to the principal's office, which is taking them out of the classroom, is can they go and pace in the back of the room out of view of the other students, but that allows them to stay in the classroom and still learning, even if they are needing to kind of pace back and forth. Just things like that. And then the last law I teach them is what's called Family First. And it actually has provisions and money set aside for kids who are 14 all the way up to the age of 23, and it's all designed to help them transition out of foster care into an adult, and it really helps them build just even independent living skills. So anything from if your kid never had to brush their teeth and they still don't know how to do it themselves, that's going to be a goal that they have to achieve. All the way up to career and college planning. So, what do they want to be when they grow up? Do they need to be going to a vocational high school so that when they come out of foster care, they've got a job immediately? Those types of things. So, I teach foster parents those three laws so that they can advocate for the kids in their homes.
That
And yeah.
that's awesome. So, a lot of schools have, school resource officers now.
Mhm.
Is there anything they can do to, like, I mean, 'cause honestly, they're a lot of times to children, they're the front lines of law enforcement,
Yeah.
because they see them every day.
Yeah.
What are some things that they can do to kind of make a positive image on these kids
Mhm.
so that way that they don't see, a negative connotation of, like, law enforcement?
Yes, and that's a great question because there is a lot of issues around, school resource officers depending on the school system again, right? Some school systems have really trained them well and have really, made the understanding that they're there more for, like, the big things. If somebody's brought a gun to school, if somebody is, selling drugs on the school grounds. But what's happened in some school districts is the school resource officers have become the disciplinary officers. And that's not what their job is supposed to be. That is the job of the teachers and the administrators. And so that's where we get into the problems, right? When they're being asked to be police within the school system, and they don't understand kids. I mean, it's kinda like those ones that, again, you got certain colleagues you would never think to be an SRO because they'd be horrible at it,
Yep,
right? And
absolutely.
unfortunately, I think sometimes that's who they get are these, people who don't understand kids, they don't understand trauma. They need to be trained just like any other school staff on what does a child with disabilities look like? What does a child with trauma look like? How do we approach kids? I went into one high school and I mean, they did it on purpose, but their school resources officers were three very big men that like dressed in black suits. You would have thought they were part of the Secret Service and they were there to intimidate.
Yep.
And the thing was, I had tons of kids who are having problems in that school. Well, because we've set that tone, and so it really is on the schools to train those SROs and use them correctly. Don't make them the disciplinarian. If a kid's running in the hallway, that's not their job. That is the job of a teacher and administrator. Their job is to be there to make sure that kids are not bringing in drugs, guns, those big things. And then
Police matters.
yeah, police matters, right?
Yep,
And really, all they're doing is containing the situation till you guys can come on the scene and take over. And that's
absolutely.
really what it should be. Now, here, I live in a suburb of Indianapolis, but we actually we have a program, what's called a youth assistance program. And what we did was we worked with the SROs to identify kids who seem to be on the verge of getting into trouble. Like they may be at risk of becoming a kid who's going to bring a gun to school or becoming a kid who's going to have drug or alcohol issues. And they became referral agents for us. And it's been really good. Since we started this program, the SROs have reported that they are much more comfortable sending them to us than calling in the police and getting this kid a record when it was just one stupid mistake, right? And so I would love to see more communities do something like that where they really engage those SROs in let's highlight who are those kids that we see continually showing some signs and then let's get them that help. Do we refer them to a school counselor? Do we refer them to somebody else rather than waiting till they make a mistake and then them having a record for the rest of their life? And
That's
so
awesome, and that's really an out of the box way of thinking of things, and,
yeah.
like, that's, kudos to them for trying something new.
Yeah. Yeah, and we had some resistance, we had some resistance. A lot of schools, they don't like to hear that maybe they have kids that sell drugs on their campus and stuff, but it happens, and so, yeah, but if we can catch them before they enter the system, how much better is our community?
Well, and, you can apply that theory to law enforcement in general. Like, you can
Mhm.
say crime doesn't happen in your town, but it does.
Oh, yeah.
And if you can prevent it before it happens, like, even
Mhm,
better.
mhm.
Um, and so
And
you
suburbs tend to be the worst because they like to think of themselves as richer, more educated, and
the
yet
safer community.
they're the kids that can afford the drugs, they're the parents that have prescription drugs sitting at home. Middle school kids, that is the biggest age group right now that's misusing, um, prescription drugs because they're too old to be in an after-school program, but they're really too young to be at home by themselves, and we don't fill that gap. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Let me ask you this. What are some things like that law enforcement, first responders in general can do to get more training in this area?
That's a good question, and it's one that, as I was talking about to people that I was gonna be on this podcast, they're like, "Oh, you need to do trainings around that." So, yes. Yeah, I do, and I don't know if you saw it, but I emailed you a link to a, document that you can put in the notes for this podcast that they can download. It's just a kind of a real quick one pager on how you can help a kid in trauma, during a crisis,
Awesome.
and
I will definitely
yes.
add that in there.
Yeah, add that in there. But yeah, contact me, and I can get you connected with resources. Talk to your school systems. Maybe they have some programs that they could work with, as much as police and schools can be working together, again, it's another team, right?
Mhm.
It's another team that we can put together. Talk to your mental health providers in the area. If you've got mental health providers, that I'm sure they'd love to come in and talk about things like disabilities and trauma and other types of mental health crises, addictions. What does addiction look like when you respond? All of those types of things. Yeah. And
Well,
really, it's just a matter, I'm sure that they've never thought about it. And all it takes is somebody to ask, hey, could you talk to us about this? And they'd probably jump all over it.
and you gotta think that, the teenage years are probably some of your most vulnerable people to drugs and alcohol.
Yes.
But the problem is once they start using, that's when those addictions start, and that
Yeah.
always that leads to worse things down the road.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's really imperative for all of us, educators, first responders, mental health professionals, to stop that early before it
Mhm.
gets out of control.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just like, you know, people locking up their guns if they're at home. How many times do we talk about locking up the alcohol? How many times do we talk about locking up the prescription drugs? Usually they're just sitting in our medicine cabinets. They're just sitting, wherever you leave your alcohol. Do we think about protecting our kids from stuff like that? We think about it with guns, but do we think about it for, like I said, middle schoolers, I mean, their brains are not here, they're not anywhere, right? So, they need that protection, and if it's just sitting out somewhere, what's stopping them from just trying it? And so, I mean, I was like that, right? I
Yep.
mean, how many of us tried alcohol or smoking or whatever in those teen years? I mean, it
Yep.
happens. The other thing is we have to be open and talk about it. So parents, family members, whoever who don't talk about the dangers of these things. Just again, if you're a gun owner, you talk to your kids about owning a gun and what it means and not touching it but do we have those same conversations with our kids about other things in the home?
And I think that, I'm a late '80s baby, but mainly a '90s kid,
Mhm.
and I think about how much the world's changed since I was a kid because, I mean, we would roam the neighborhoods as long as my parents knew where I was going, but it's not the same world.
Mm-mm.
and I think we're slowly getting better, but we're not where we need to be on
No.
addressing these hard topics that
Right.
in today's age and age must happen.
Mhm.
Um, and
'Cause if
I
they
think
don't hear it from you, they're gonna hear it from social media.
absolutely.
I mean,
And
yeah,
yep,
it's out there. Nothing is hidden.
yep. And it like I said, I mean, it's just it's different with everything at your fingertips now.
Mm,
Like you've got to address these issues head on
yeah,
and start that campaign of like, hey, don't go down this route.
yeah,
And whatever the topic may be.
yeah,
Um, and
yeah.
that's unfortunately that's the world we live in, but you know, it's
Mhm.
part of being proactive.
It is, and yeah, and we're such a reactive society that, yeah, it's hard for us to think proactively, but we need to think proactively.
So
Mhm.
talk to me. Is that a book in your background or
That
what
is
is?
a report that I wrote, and, it's called A Path Forward, Transforming the Futures of Kids Aging Out of Care, and what it is an educational report that I wrote and that I sent out to all the states, basically just showing how foster kids compare to other kids educationally, and basically what it comes down to is for every, 3 kids that graduate high school, maybe 1 foster kid will graduate, so about
Wow,
one third. And then I also looked at things like English, math, and science proficiency scores, and, foster kids do about half as well as, kids who are not in foster care, which is kinda scary because post-COVID, our, proficiency scores are kind of around 50, 60%. They're not very high for an average kid, so a foster kid is at 30%. Yeah, our kids are just that's why they're not graduating. That's why they're not getting jobs right now. A quarter of the foster kids that, age out without a high school diploma.
wow.
They're
That's something we've got to work on to get
Yeah,
better.
yeah, only 50% at the age of 21 will have a full or even a part-time job. So, the employment rate. So, it and when we talk about, some people wanna talk about it in money, there was a report that was said that, for every kid that ages out, it costs our country $300,000.
Wow,
Well, we age out 20,000 kids every year, so every year is $1 billion.
wow,
Yeah,
that's crazy.
yeah.
So if they want to get a copy of that, where could they find a copy of that at?
They can find it through me, on my website, and it's just, www.sharondunlevy.com. So, yeah.
Awesome. So if somebody wants to follow you, like, and because you've got a lot of great information, if they want to reach out to you, how do they reach out to you?
Best place to find me is LinkedIn, and if you type in Sharon Dunlevy, I will come right up. But yeah, I'm all over LinkedIn, so I'm on Facebook, but I don't do much on it.
Yep. So I want to give you the closing word tonight.
Okay.
Um, what is something that touches your heart or something that we can do better at that, your call to action?
My call to action is to start paying attention to, what's going on with foster kids, and it's hard because we don't talk about it a lot. And I've been trying to kind of push this in all the podcasts that I do. I especially would like for religious organizations to think about opening their doors to foster parents. Foster parents need support. They need support groups, and they need a place where they feel safe to meet, where maybe the church or whatever organization could even provide childcare because that's hard to find, childcare, but they need to be able to meet with other foster parents. So, if I would love to see some more community centers like that opening their doors for foster parents and letting the kids come. And here in Indianapolis, like our museums are mostly free for foster parents, things like that. But they need that time where they can be one on one with other foster parents to really just get that sense of community and support. And our churches and our religious organizations are really the best ideal locations for that.
Yep. Yeah, because you really have to have a safe environment, and
Mhm.
We actually have something similar. It's not necessarily just for foster parents and kids, but it's really like a teenager style, um, like a church-based, like, hangout that they can hang out in a safe
Mhm.
environment, and, I might talk to them because I think that would be a great idea is, like, do
Yeah.
a foster night or
Yeah.
foster weekend,
Yeah.
because
You'll be surprised how many foster parents are in your community that you don't even know because
Mhm.
they don't always say anything, right?
Yeah, I actually had a friend of mine on Facebook the other day shared, and I had no idea that they were a foster parent,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm like, "That's awesome." I had
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah.
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 Well, Sharon, it's been great having you.
Thank you.
And so again, guys, reach out to her. She's got a lot of great knowledge.
Mhm.
And I'm so excited you're here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, Brent.